My name's Zara, and when I submitted my resignation letter at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, my boss Garrett laughed in my face and called it pathetic drivel from someone who clearly can't handle real business. He read it aloud to the entire executive team, mocking every word while they snickered behind their laptops. What they didn't know was that I had already been secretly meeting with their biggest client, Meridian Industries, for 3 weeks. And while Garrett was busy humiliating me in that conference room, I had copies of every unethical practice, every inflated bill, and every lie they'd told their clients sitting in a secure folder on my desk. In the end, they weren't the ones who destroyed my career. I was the one who built my empire on the ashes of theirs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I walked into the Pinnacle Marketing Solutions office for what I knew would be the last time, the Seattle rain was hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown building like tiny bullets. I'd practiced this moment in my bathroom mirror for weeks, rehearsing the exact words I'd use, the tone I'd maintain, the way I'd hold my shoulders back when I handed Garrett my resignation. What I hadn't practiced was the aftermath, the public humiliation that would follow, or the way my so-called colleagues would turn into vultures the moment they smelled weakness. I arrived early that Tuesday morning, just like I had every day for the past 4 years. The office still smelled like industrial coffee and the faint trace of yesterday's catered lunch. Probably another client celebration I wasn't invited to, despite managing half the accounts they were celebrating. I'd grown used to being excluded from the inner circle, used to watching Garrett promote less qualified men while passing me over for senior positions I'd practically built myself. But this morning felt different. This morning, I held the power. My resignation letter sat in a manila envelope in my leather bag, crisp and formal, every word carefully chosen. But it wasn't just a resignation letter, it was a declaration of war disguised as professional courtesy. Hidden between the standard 2 weeks' notice and polite gratitude was language that would protect me legally, while making it clear I knew exactly what kind of operation Garrett was running. The executive team was already gathering in the glass conference room when I knocked on Garrett's office door. Through the frosted glass, I could see his silhouette leaning back in that ridiculous ergonomic chair he'd special ordered, while denying the rest of us basic office supplies. His voice boomed through the door, probably on another call with a client he'd inevitably disappoint. "Come in," he called, not bothering to look up from his phone. Garrett Thornfield was the kind of man who wore expensive suits to hide his cheap character. Tall, silver-haired, with the practiced smile of someone who'd built a career on other people's work. He'd founded Pinnacle 15 years ago with his college roommate's trust fund and had been taking credit for everyone else's successes ever since. I'd watched him steal ideas, manipulate contracts, and throw subordinates under the bus so many times that I'd started keeping detailed records, not because I planned to use them, but because I couldn't believe someone could be that consistently unethical. "Garrett," I said, placing the envelope on his mahogany desk, "I need to submit my formal resignation." For a moment, he just stared at the envelope like it was a foreign object. Then his expression shifted from confusion to amusement, and finally to something that looked almost like relief. "Resignation?" He picked up the envelope, weighing it in his hands. Well, I have to say, Zara, this is unexpected timing." He opened it slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the first few lines. I watched his face change as he read, noting the moment his smirk faltered and his jaw tightened. The letter was professionally worded, but anyone who knew what to look for would understand that I wasn't just leaving. I was drawing battle lines. "This is," he started, then stopped. "You know what? I think the whole team should hear this." Before I could object, he was standing, striding toward the conference room with my letter in hand. I followed, my heart hammering but my expression calm. Through the glass walls, I could see the other executives looking up as Garrett burst through the door. Everyone, Garrett announced, holding up my letter like a trophy. "We have some entertainment this morning. Zara here has decided to grace us with a resignation letter." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Janet Morrison, the HR director, who'd been systematically undermining every woman in the company for years, looked up from her iPad with poorly concealed glee. David Fletcher, The sales director, who'd been taking credit for my client relationships, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. And there was Bryce Hamilton, the marketing VP, who'd once told me I was too emotional for leadership during a meeting where he'd literally thrown a stapler across the room in frustration. "Listen to this," Garrett continued, clearing his throat theatrically. "After careful consideration of my career trajectory and professional values, I have decided to pursue opportunities that better align with my commitment to ethical business practices and client-centered service." He paused, looking around the room. Ethical business practices. Can you believe that? From someone who couldn't even handle the Meridian Industries account without crying in the bathroom. That wasn't true, and everyone in the room knew it. I'd never cried in the bathroom over Meridian Industries. I'd saved their account after Garrett's incompetence nearly lost them $2.3 million in revenue. But I said nothing. I just stood there, hands clasped in front of me, watching him perform for his audience. "But wait, there's more," Garrett continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "I believe that transparency and honest communication with clients is paramount to successful long-term partnerships. Therefore, I will be transitioning my responsibilities to ensure minimal disruption to client relationships." Janet actually laughed out loud at that. Transparent communication? That's rich, coming from someone who's been undermining team decisions for months. "The whole thing is pathetic," Garrett concluded, folding the letter and tossing it onto the conference table like discarded trash. "Honestly, Zara, this reads like something a college freshman would write after their first business ethics class. Ethical business practices, client-centered service. What's next? A mission statement about synergy and paradigm shifts." The laughter that followed felt like acid in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. David Fletcher was practically howling, slapping the table as if Garrett had just delivered the punchline of the century. Even some of the junior staff members who'd wandered over to see what the commotion was about were smirking behind their coffee cups. "You know what the funniest part is?" Garrett continued, warming up to his audience. "She thinks she's taking some kind of moral high ground here. Like she's above all this. Like she's too good for the real world of business. Newsflash, sweetheart, this industry isn't a charity. If you can't handle the heat, maybe you should stick to nonprofit work." That last comment hit exactly where he'd intended it to. Everyone in the room knew I'd mentioned wanting to do more meaningful work, that I'd once suggested the company consider pro bono clients. It had been a casual comment during a brainstorming session, but Garrett had filed it away like ammunition, waiting for the perfect moment to use it against me. "Any last words?" he asked, his tone suggesting he hoped I'd say something he could mock further. I looked around the room at these people I'd worked alongside for 4 years. People I'd helped with projects, covered for during personal emergencies, celebrated with during company milestones. People who were now watching my professional execution with the enthusiasm of spectators at a medieval hanging. "Just one thing," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "I hope you'll remember this conversation." Garrett's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, I'm sure we will. This has been the most entertainment we've had in months." As I walked out of that conference room for the last time, my resignation letter still lying crumpled on the table like a piece of garbage, I could hear their laughter following me down the hallway. I gathered my personal items methodically. The small succulent plant my assistant had given me, the coffee mug from the Portland Marketing Conference, the framed photo of my graduation from Northwestern that I'd been too optimistic to take down earlier. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't have known as they celebrated my humiliation, was that my phone had been buzzing steadily in my pocket throughout their entire performance. 3 missed calls from Chloe Rodriguez at Meridian Industries, Pinnacle's biggest client and nearly 30% of their annual revenue.
The same Chloe Rodriguez who'd been asking increasingly pointed questions about billing irregularities for the past month. The same Chloe who'd asked me to personally review some discrepancies in their account. The same Chloe who'd suggested, just last week, that perhaps our arrangement didn't have to end when my time at Pinnacle did. As I walked toward the elevator, my bag heavy with 4 years of accumulated memories and carefully documented evidence, I smiled for the first time that morning. Because while Garrett was busy making jokes about my pathetic resignation letter, I was about to show him what pathetic really looked like. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I should have seen it coming from my very first day at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions 4 years ago. The warning signs were there, glaring like neon lights in a dark alley, but I was 26, fresh out of Northwestern with my MBA, and desperate to prove myself in the competitive Seattle marketing scene. I mistook Garrett's condescending smiles for mentorship and Janet's backhanded compliments for workplace banter. I thought I was walking into my dream job. Instead, I was stepping into a carefully constructed nightmare. The office itself should have been my first clue. Pinnacle occupied the 32nd floor of the Rainier Tower, all glass and steel with panoramic views of Elliott Bay. It looked impressive from the outside, the kind of place that screamed success and innovation. But once you got past the marble lobby and rode the elevator up to our floor, you started to notice the cracks. The reception area was immaculate, designed to impress potential clients with its sleek furniture and carefully curated art. But step beyond those frosted glass doors into the actual workspace, and you'd find outdated computers, flickering fluorescent lights, and a coffee machine that had been broken for 8 months. Garrett had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. The rest of us were crammed into an open-concept workspace that he claimed promoted, quote, collaboration and transparency, but really just meant he could monitor our every movement from his glass tower. The conference room where he'd just humiliated me was the only other space with any dignity: polished mahogany table, leather chairs, and a view that clients found impressive enough to ignore the subpar work they were paying premium prices for. But it wasn't the physical space that should have warned me. It was the people. Garrett Thornfield had mastered the art of corporate manipulation so thoroughly that he could undermine you while making you grateful for the experience. He was 48, divorced twice, and had built his entire identity around being the kind of visionary leader who spoke in buzzwords and treated his employees like disposable resources. He had this way of tilting his head when he spoke to you, like he was patiently explaining quantum physics to a toddler, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Janet Morrison, our HR director, was Garrett's perfect accomplice. She'd been with the company for 12 years, ever since her husband left her for his dental hygienist, and she needed to rebuild her life from scratch. But instead of using that experience to empathize with other women facing challenges, she'd chosen to become the gatekeeper who made sure no other woman could threaten her position. She was 53, impeccably dressed, and had perfected the art of destroying careers with policy citations and performance improvement plans. Then there was David Fletcher, the sales director who'd somehow convinced everyone he was a rainmaker despite consistently missing his targets. David was 35, married to a woman who made twice his salary, and compensated for his professional inadequacies by taking credit for everyone else's client relationships. He had this nervous laugh that he deployed whenever someone called him out on his lies, and a habit of interrupting women mid-sentence to clarify points they'd already made perfectly clear. And Bryce Hamilton, the marketing VP who'd been passed over for Garrett's position when the company was founded and had spent 15 years taking out his resentment on everyone below him in the hierarchy. Bryce was the kind of man who used military metaphors in every meeting, called difficult projects uphill battles, and treated any disagreement as a personal attack on his authority. He was 42, permanently single, and lived in a downtown condo that he'd decorated to look like a sports bar. My desk was positioned in the middle of the open workspace, directly in Garrett's line of sight but far enough from the executive offices that I couldn't hear the conversations that shaped my career behind closed doors. I shared the space with about 15 other employees, account coordinators, junior executives, and administrative staff who all understood that survival at Pinnacle meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. The client I'd been thinking about during my resignation, Chloe Rodriguez from Meridian Industries, had first walked into our office on a rainy Thursday morning in October 3 months ago. I remembered the day clearly because it was the same day Garrett had publicly reprimanded me for overstepping boundaries when I'd suggested a more cost-effective media strategy for one of our struggling accounts. Chloe was 39, the chief marketing officer for Meridian Industries, a sustainable technology company that had been growing at breakneck speed for the past 5 years. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was expensive without being flashy, carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned every opportunity she'd been given, and had the kind of direct eye contact that made you feel like she could see straight through corporate bullshit. "I've heard good things about Pinnacle," she'd said during that first meeting, though her tone suggested she was still forming her own opinion, specifically about the strategic work on the Evergreen Solar campaign. That campaign had been my baby from start to finish. I'd developed the messaging strategy, managed the creative development, and personally handled the media relationships that had turned a small renewable energy company into a regional success story. But when Garrett responded to Chloe's comment, he'd smiled and said, "That's the kind of innovative thinking our team brings to every project." Our team. As if he'd done anything more than sign off on the final budget. I'd watched Chloe's expression carefully during that meeting, noting how she nodded politely at Garrett's presentations while taking detailed notes about implementation timelines and accountability measures. When she asked specific questions about campaign metrics and client communication protocols, Garrett had deflected to me with phrases like, "Zara can walk you through the tactical details," and "our account management team handles the day-to-day execution." It was a pattern I'd seen countless times before. Garrett would charm potential clients with big-picture vision and industry connections, then quietly shift all the actual work to his staff, while maintaining the illusion that he was personally overseeing every detail. He was like a magician who'd perfected the art of making other people's work disappear and reappear under his name. But Chloe seemed different from our other clients. She asked follow-up questions that suggested she understood the difference between strategy and execution. When Garrett mentioned our proprietary methodology for digital engagement, she asked to see case studies with specific ROI data. When he talked about our innovative approach to brand positioning, she wanted to know who would be writing the creative briefs and how the approval process would work. Most importantly, she kept directing her technical questions to me, even when Garrett tried to intercede with his own interpretations of my answers. It was subtle, but I caught it. The way she'd maintain eye contact with me while Garrett was speaking, the way she'd nod at my explanations, and then glance at him with barely concealed skepticism when he tried to add his own commentary. After that first meeting, I'd been assigned as the primary account manager for Meridian Industries. It was a significant promotion in responsibility, though not in title or compensation. Garrett framed it as a development opportunity and a sign of his confidence in my abilities. What he really meant was that he wanted someone else to do the work, while he took credit for the results. The Meridian account quickly became the highlight of my career at Pinnacle. Chloe was demanding but fair, creative but practical, and she had the kind of vision for her company that made the work feel meaningful instead of just profitable. We developed campaigns that actually moved the needle on sustainable technology adoption, created content that educated consumers instead of just manipulating them, and built media relationships that served the broader industry instead of just Meridian's bottom line. But with every success, Garrett became more possessive of the relationship and more dismissive of my contributions. Client calls that I'd been leading for months suddenly required his oversight. Strategy documents I'd written started appearing in presentations with his name at the top. And worst of all, he began scheduling check-in meetings with Chloe that I wasn't invited to, claiming he needed to maintain executive-level relationships with high-value clients. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, during what should have been a routine quarterly review meeting. Chloe had specifically requested a detailed breakdown of our campaign performance metrics, including cost per acquisition data and brand awareness tracking that I'd been managing personally. I'd prepared a comprehensive presentation with charts, graphs, and strategic recommendations for the next quarter. But when we arrived at the conference room, Garrett had his own presentation ready, one that included all of my data but none of my insights, all of my research but none of my strategic thinking. He presented my work as if it were his own creation, occasionally gesturing to me with comments like, "Zara helped pull together some of the supporting data," and, quote, "Our team did excellent execution on the tactical elements." I'd sat there in stunned silence, watching 3 months of my work being repackaged and resold under someone else's brand. But what made it worse was watching Chloe's reaction. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the way she kept glancing between Garrett's presentation and my face, clearly trying to reconcile the person who'd been managing her account with the person who was now taking all the credit. After the meeting, as Garrett walked Chloe to the elevator with his usual glad-handing routine, she'd lingered behind to speak with me privately. "That was an interesting presentation," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm glad you found it useful," I'd replied, not trusting myself to say more. The strategic recommendations were particularly insightful, very similar to the ideas we discussed during our call last week. My heart had stopped. Chloe remembered our conversations, remembered my ideas, and she was making it clear that she knew exactly who had done the real work. "I hope we can continue that level of strategic thinking moving forward," she'd continued, handing me her business card even though we'd been working together for months. "Perhaps we should schedule some additional check-ins to ensure we're staying aligned on the creative direction." I'd taken the card, noting that she'd written her direct cell phone number on the back, something she'd never done before. That night, I'd gone home to my small Capitol Hill apartment and sat on my couch for hours, staring at Chloe's business card and trying to decide what to do next. I could confront Garrett about the stolen presentation, but I'd seen how those conversations went for other employees who'd challenged his authority. I could file a complaint with Janet, but she'd already demonstrated her loyalty to Garrett's version of events over anyone else's truth. Or I could do something different. Something that would change the game entirely. The next morning, I'd called the number on the back of Chloe's business card. The phone call that changed everything happened on a Wednesday morning at 7:43 a.m., exactly 18 minutes before I was supposed to walk into another day of watching Garrett take credit for my work. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee mug in one hand and Chloe's business card in the other, when I finally dialed the number she'd written on the back. "Chloe Rodriguez," she answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Hi Chloe, it's Zara from Pinnacle. I hope I'm not calling too early, but I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday about strategic alignment." There was a pause, and I could hear her moving, probably walking somewhere more private. "Actually, Zara, I'm glad you called. I've been thinking about our discussion, and I have some concerns about the direction of our partnership." My stomach dropped. "Concerns?" "Not about your work," she said quickly. "Your work has been exceptional. But I'm starting to question whether Pinnacle as an organization is the right fit for what Meridian Industries needs moving forward." I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, trying to process what she was saying. "Can you help me understand what's driving those concerns?" "Yesterday's presentation was illuminating," Chloe said carefully. "The strategic recommendations were identical to ideas we'd discussed in our private calls, but they were presented as if they'd originated from someone who's never actually worked on the tactical implementation. It made me wonder how many other clients are paying premium rates for recycled insights. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I had to grip the edge of the table. She knew. Chloe had seen through Garrett's performance and recognized what was really happening. "I understand your concerns," I said, choosing my words carefully. "And I appreciate your honesty about the presentation. Zara, can I ask you something directly?" Chloe's voice had shifted to something more personal, more urgent. "Are you happy at Pinnacle?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could give her the standard corporate response about growth opportunities and team collaboration. Or I could tell her the truth that had been eating at me for months. "No," I said simply, "I'm not." "I didn't think so." I could hear her typing in the background. Listen, I know this is unconventional, but would you be willing to meet for coffee this morning before you go into the office? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. An hour later, I was sitting across from Chloe at a small cafe in Pioneer Square, watching her stir sugar into her latte while she carefully outlined an opportunity that would either save my career or destroy it completely. Meridian Industries is expanding our marketing capabilities, she began, her voice low enough that the other customers couldn't overhear. We're looking to bring more functions in-house, particularly strategic planning and campaign development. We need someone who understands our brand, our values, and our market position. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Your work over the past 3 months has been exactly what we're looking for. The Evergreen Solar Campaign, the sustainability messaging framework, the media strategy that increased our qualified leads by 47%. That's the kind of thinking we want to build on. What are you saying? I asked, though I was already beginning to understand. I'm saying that if you were interested in making a change, we'd be very interested in having that conversation, as our Director of Strategic Marketing. With a team, a budget, and the authority to implement your ideas without having to worry about someone else taking credit. The title hit me like a physical blow. Director of Strategic Marketing. It was 2 levels above my current position at Pinnacle, with the kind of responsibility and recognition I'd been fighting for since my first day. The salary would be competitive, Chloe continued, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table, along with equity options and a signing bonus to help with the transition. I opened the paper and had to read the number twice. It was nearly double my current salary, plus benefits that Pinnacle had never offered, and stock options that could be worth significant money if Meridian continued its growth trajectory. This is incredibly generous, I managed to say. It's market rate for someone with your skills and experience. The fact that you've been undervalued at your current position doesn't mean we should continue that pattern. I stared at the offer, my mind racing through the implications. Taking this job would mean leaving Pinnacle immediately, probably burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. It would mean starting over with a new company, new colleagues, new challenges. But it would also mean freedom from Garrett's manipulation, from Janet's passive aggression, from the daily humiliation of watching my work disappear into someone else's portfolio. There's one thing I need to tell you, I said, meeting Chloe's eyes. If I leave Pinnacle, they're going to do everything they can to damage the relationship with Meridian. Garrett won't take this quietly. Chloe smiled, and for the first time since I had known her, it looked almost predatory. Let me worry about Garrett. We've been documenting some concerning patterns in our billing and service delivery that we'd like to discuss with Pinnacle's leadership team. In fact, we've already scheduled a meeting for next week to address these issues. My blood went cold. What kind of patterns? Inflated hours, duplicate charges, work billed at senior rates that was clearly done by junior staff. The kind of discrepancies that make a client wonder what else they haven't been told. I thought about all the times I'd watched Garrett pad hours on client reports, all the times he'd billed strategy work at his rate when I'd done the actual thinking, all the times he'd charged for revisions that had never actually been made. I'd assumed it was just aggressive billing practices, the kind of corner cutting that happened at agencies trying to maximize profit margins. How long have you known? I asked. I started noticing inconsistencies about 6 weeks ago. Small things at first, meeting notes that didn't match my recollection of our conversations, time entries that didn't align with actual deliverables. But when I started paying closer attention, the pattern became obvious. And you've been documenting it. Extensively. Screenshots of billing reports. Email chains showing contradictory information. Recorded calls where promises were made that were never fulfilled. We take vendor relationships very seriously at Meridian, and when we invest in a partnership, we expect transparency and accountability. The full scope of what she was telling me began to sink in. This wasn't just about offering me a job. This was about Meridian Industries conducting their own investigation into Pinnacle's business practices. An investigation that could potentially destroy the company's reputation, and cost them their biggest client. Zara, I want to be completely clear about something, Chloe continued. This job offer isn't contingent on any information you might have about Pinnacle's operations. You've earned this opportunity based on your own merit and the quality of your work. But if you decide to join our team, and if you have insights that could help us understand the full extent of the billing irregularities we've discovered, that information would be valuable to our ongoing evaluation. She was giving me an out, a way to take the job without feeling like I was betraying my current employer. But she was also making it clear that Pinnacle was already in serious trouble, with or without my involvement. I need some time to think about this, I said. Of course. But Zara? Chloe reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. Don't let loyalty to people who don't respect you keep you from opportunities you've earned. You're better than what they're giving you credit for. I walked back to the Pinnacle office in a daze, Chloe's offer folded in my jacket pocket like a secret weapon. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt different somehow, like I was seeing the space through new eyes. The marble lobby that had once impressed me now looked like expensive makeup covering up deeper problems. The frosted glass doors with the Pinnacle logo seemed less like a gateway to success and more like a barrier keeping me trapped. When I reached my desk, there was an email waiting from Garrett with the subject line, Meridian Industries Strategic Alignment. The message was brief and dismissive. Good work on yesterday's presentation. Let's schedule a debrief to discuss next steps for the account. I'll be taking point on strategic communications moving forward. Taking point on strategic communications. Translation. He was planning to cut me out of direct client contact, now that he'd successfully positioned himself as the strategic mastermind behind Meridian's success. It was exactly the kind of move I'd seen him make with other successful accounts, gradually marginalizing the actual account manager until they became invisible. But this time he'd miscalculated. This time, the client had seen through his performance and was already planning an exit strategy that would take more than just the account away from him. I spent the rest of that day in a strange, detached state, going through the motions of my normal responsibilities while my mind raced through the implications of Chloe's offer. During the morning staff meeting, I watched Garrett present updates on his accounts, including a glowing report on Meridian's campaign performance that was built entirely on metrics I'd compiled. During lunch, I listened to Janet complain about unrealistic client expectations, while she planned to cut the administrative support budget that kept the rest of us functional. During the afternoon, I sat through a presentation from David about innovative sales strategies that were actually just repackaged versions of approaches I'd suggested months earlier. It was like watching a play I'd seen too many times, performed by actors who'd forgotten they were supposed to be convincing. The illusion had been shattered, and I couldn't unsee the machinery behind the performance. At 4:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. No pressure on timing, but wanted you to know the offer stands. You have support here whenever you're ready. I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it and cleared my phone's cache. But I didn't need the text anymore. I'd already made my decision. That night, I went home and started writing 2 documents. The first was my resignation letter, carefully worded to protect me legally while making it clear that I was leaving due to irreconcilable differences in professional values. The second was a detailed timeline of every billing irregularity, credit theft, and ethical violation I'd witnessed during my 4 years at Pinnacle. I wasn't planning to use the second document as a weapon. I was planning to use it as insurance. Because if Garrett thought he could humiliate me on my way out the door, he was about to learn that some people fight back with more than just words. The humiliation didn't end with Garrett's theatrical reading of my resignation letter. As I walked back to my desk after the conference room debacle, carrying the weight of their laughter on my shoulders, I discovered that my professional execution was just getting started. Janet Morrison was already at my computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as she systematically locked me out of every system I'd spent 4 years learning to navigate. Email access, revoked. Client management database, blocked. Shared drives with campaign materials I'd created from scratch, inaccessible. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, probably many times, to other employees who dared to challenge the Pinnacle hierarchy. "We need to protect client confidentiality," she said without looking up, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'm sure you understand." What I understood was that she was erasing 4 years of my professional life in real time, making sure I couldn't access any of the work that proved my value to potential future employers. It was a calculated move, designed to leave me professionally naked and vulnerable. "I'll need access to download my personal files," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Janet's smile could have frozen coffee. "Personal files should have been stored on personal devices. Company policy clearly states that business computers are for business use only." She handed me a small cardboard box, the kind used for office supplies. "You have 15 minutes to collect any personal belongings. Security will escort you out after that." 15 minutes. 4 years of my career reduced to a quarter-hour cleanup operation. I started gathering the few personal items scattered around my workspace. The small succulent plant that had somehow survived under the fluorescent lighting, a Northwestern University mug my sorority sisters had given me when I started the job, a desk calendar with coffee stains marking particularly brutal deadlines. But as I packed, I became aware of something else happening around me. My colleagues, people I'd worked alongside every day, shared lunch conversations with, helped through personal crises, were actively avoiding eye contact. Zara from graphic design, who'd borrowed my car when hers was in the shop last month, suddenly became fascinated by her computer screen. Marcus from accounts receivable, who'd asked for my help preparing for his performance review just 2 weeks ago, found urgent business at the copy machine. Even Lisa, the receptionist, who'd always been friendly and inclusive, was mysteriously absent from her usual post. It was like watching a magic trick where people disappeared in plain sight. The message was clear. I was radioactive now, and association with me could be dangerous to their own job security. Garrett had orchestrated this perfectly, turning my resignation into a public warning to anyone else who might be considering similar disloyalty. But the worst was yet to come. As I was wrapping my coffee mug in tissue paper, David Fletcher appeared at my desk with a clipboard, and what he probably thought was a sympathetic expression. "Zara, we need to do a quick transition meeting for your accounts, just to make sure we don't drop any balls during the handover." I looked up from my packing. "What transition meeting? I was just told I have 15 minutes to leave." "Well, technically you've resigned, but we still need to protect our client relationships. Professional responsibility and all that." His nervous laugh made an appearance. "It'll just take a few minutes. We want to make sure we have all the passwords, contact information, project status updates, the basics." What he was really asking for was a complete download of everything I knew about every client relationship I'd managed, every campaign I'd developed, every strategic insight I'd gained through months of careful relationship building. They wanted to strip mine my professional knowledge before throwing me out the door. "I think that should be handled through proper transition documentation," I said carefully, "with adequate time for preparation and review." David's expression hardened slightly. "Zara, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. We're trying to be professional here." Professional. The word tasted like vinegar in my mouth. There was nothing professional about public humiliation, nothing professional about immediate system lockouts, nothing professional about demanding instant knowledge transfer, while security waited to escort me out like a criminal. "You have my resignation letter," I said, continuing to pack my belongings. "Any specific questions about account transitions can be directed to Garrett, since he's indicated he'll be taking over strategic communications." Before David could respond, Bryce Hamilton materialized beside my desk like a bad omen. "Problem here, Fletcher?" "Just trying to facilitate a smooth transition," David said, his nervous energy ratcheting up another notch. "But Zara seems reluctant to cooperate with the handover process." Bryce's military metaphors were about to make an appearance. I could see it in his posture. "Look, Daniels," he said, using my last name like we were in boot camp, "we're trying to help you leave on a professional note here." But if you want to burn bridges on your way out, that's your choice. Just remember that this industry is smaller than you think. The threat was barely veiled. Cooperate with our knowledge extraction, or we'll make sure your reputation follows you wherever you go. It was the kind of intimidation that had worked on other departing employees, the reason why people left Pinnacle quietly and never spoke publicly about their experiences. But what Bryce didn't know was that I'd spent the last 12 hours documenting every unethical practice I'd witnessed, every client relationship I'd built that they were about to claim as their own, every strategic insight they were planning to repackage under someone else's name. His threats felt like water rolling off my back, because I was no longer playing by their rules. "I understand your concerns about the transition," I said, meeting his eyes steadily, "and I'm sure you'll manage just fine. After all, according to yesterday's presentation, the strategic thinking comes from the executive level anyway." Bryce's face flushed slightly, recognizing his own corporate speak being reflected back at him. Before he could respond, Janet reappeared with a security guard, a tired-looking man in his 50s who clearly found this whole situation as uncomfortable as I did. "Time's up," Janet announced with satisfaction. "Security will walk you out." I closed the cardboard box and picked up my purse, taking one last look around the workspace that had defined my professional identity for 4 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were so focused on protecting themselves from what I might take with me that they had no idea what I'd already given away. The walk to the elevator felt like a perp walk, with Janet leading the procession and the security guard trailing behind me as if I might make a run for it. I could feel eyes on me from every corner of the office, colleagues pretending to work while actually watching my professional execution with the morbid fascination of drivers passing a car accident. As we passed the conference room where Garrett had performed his comedy routine an hour earlier, I could see him through the glass walls, already on the phone with someone, probably spinning the story of my departure to minimize any potential damage to client relationships. He looked up as we walked by, caught my eye for a split second, and had the audacity to nod at me like we were colleagues parting on friendly terms. The elevator ride down 32 floors felt endless. Janet stood beside me in silence, probably composing the email she'd send to the team about my sudden departure and the importance of maintaining professional standards. The security guard stared at the floor numbers, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. And I stood there with my cardboard box of personal belongings, looking like every corporate casualty who'd ever been escorted out of a building after challenging the wrong people. But appearances, as I was about to prove, could be deceiving. When the elevator doors opened into the marble lobby, I walked across the polished floor with my head held high, my stride steady and purposeful. The security guard held the glass door for me, a small kindness that I appreciated more than he could know. And then I was outside, standing on the sidewalk in the Seattle drizzle, with my entire professional life reduced to a small cardboard box. Janet had probably expected me to look defeated, maybe even to cry a little. Instead, I pulled out my phone and sent a 3-word text to Chloe Rodriguez. "I accept. Today." Her response came back within minutes. "Welcome to Meridian. Can you start Monday? We have work to do." As I hailed a taxi to take me home, I caught my reflection in the building's glass facade. I didn't look like someone who'd just been professionally destroyed. I looked like someone who'd just been set free. Because while Garrett and his team were celebrating their successful intimidation tactics, they had no idea that their biggest client had already jumped ship, taking not just the account, but all the institutional knowledge that made it valuable. They'd spent so much energy humiliating me that they'd completely missed the fact that I was never really the target. I was the weapon. And in about 72 hours, when Chloe's transition meeting with Pinnacle's executive team began, they were going to discover exactly how much damage a properly motivated weapon could do. That weekend, sitting in my Capitol Hill apartment with a cup of tea and a stack of old client files I'd legally taken home over the years for reference purposes, I finally allowed myself to see the pattern that had been destroying my career in slow motion. It wasn't just the credit theft or the public humiliation. It was the systematic erosion of my professional confidence, carefully orchestrated over 4 years to keep me grateful for scraps while they feasted on my work. I spread the files across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too close to solve. The evergreen solar campaign that had launched my reputation, the sustainable packaging initiative for Northwest Foods that had won 3 industry awards, the digital transformation strategy for Coastal Credit Union that had increased their membership by 38%. Every major success had the same signature: my strategic thinking, my client relationship management, my late nights perfecting presentations that someone else would deliver. But there was more than just stolen credit buried in these files. As I traced back through email chains and project timelines, I discovered a pattern of deliberate sabotage disguised as mentorship. The client meeting where Garrett had accidentally double-booked me during a crucial presentation, forcing me to send my materials ahead while he delivered them as his own ideas. The strategy session where Janet had questioned my emotional readiness for senior-level responsibilities, coincidentally right before a promotion cycle. The performance review where Bryce had cited my quote-quote collaboration challenges based on conflicts that he'd privately encouraged. They hadn't just been taking credit for my work, they'd been actively undermining my ability to advance, creating a glass ceiling disguised as developmental feedback. Every time I'd come close to breaking through to the next level, some mysterious obstacle had appeared, some character flaw had been discovered, some growth opportunity had been identified that required me to prove myself all over again. The most damaging revelation came in a folder I'd almost forgotten about: performance improvement plans that had been drafted but never implemented. Janet had prepared formal documentation for disciplinary action against me multiple times over the years, always following my biggest successes. The timing wasn't coincidental. Every time I delivered exceptional results that might have justified a promotion or salary increase, she'd created a paper trail suggesting I was actually underperforming. The Meridian Industries file was particularly illuminating. Janet had drafted a performance improvement plan just 2 weeks after I'd landed the account, citing, quote, communication challenges and difficulty managing client expectations. But when I cross-referenced the dates with my email archives, I realized she'd written the PIP on the same day that Meridian had sent Garrett a glowing review of my strategic work, specifically requesting that I remain their primary point of contact. They'd been planning to remove me from the account from the beginning, not because of any performance issues, but because my success was becoming too visible, too valuable, too threatening to their carefully maintained hierarchy. The performance improvement plan was insurance, a way to justify taking away my biggest professional achievement if I ever became inconvenient. But what made my hands shake as I read through these documents wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization of how close they'd come to succeeding. If Chloe hadn't seen through Garrett's presentation, if she hadn't reached out directly, if I hadn't found the courage to answer that phone call, I would have spent years more trapped in this cycle, slowly losing confidence in my own abilities while they systematically destroyed my career potential. The financial documents were even more damning. I'd kept copies of my timesheets and project budgets, and when I started calculating the real numbers, the scope of their billing fraud became clear. The Meridian account alone showed over $147,000 in inflated charges over 6 months, hours billed at Garrett's senior rate for work I'd done, strategy sessions charged as executive consultation when I'd been the only one participating, revisions that had never actually happened but appeared on invoices as additional creative development. I spent Sunday morning creating a comprehensive timeline, cross-referencing every questionable billing entry with my own records of actual work performed. The pattern was consistent across every major account I'd managed: systematic inflation of hours, false attribution of work, and charges for services that had never been delivered. It wasn't just unethical. It was criminal fraud, the kind that could result in federal charges if the right prosecutor decided to pursue it. By Sunday afternoon, I had assembled a portfolio that painted a picture of systematic abuse at every level: professional, financial, and personal. But the most powerful evidence wasn't in the financial records or the performance improvement plans. It was in the emails, hundreds of them, where Garrett, Janet, Bryce, and David had discussed their strategies for managing, quote, problem employees who showed too much initiative or demanded too much recognition. One email chain from 8 months ago was particularly revealing. Janet had sent a message to the executive team with the subject line, "Managing High Performer Expectations," outlining strategies for, quote, containing ambitious junior staff who might threaten organizational stability. The recommendations included rotating high-visibility assignments to prevent any individual from building too much client loyalty, implementing peer review processes that could be used to undermine confidence, and creating development plans that focused on emotional intelligence rather than tactical promotions. It was a blueprint for professional gaslighting, a systematic approach to keeping talented employees trapped in subordinate roles while extracting maximum value from their work. And according to the email timestamps, they'd been refining these strategies for years, probably implementing them against dozens of employees who'd never understood why their careers had stalled despite strong performance. The most chilling part was a response from Bryce that read, "The key is making them believe the limitations are their own fault. Self-doubt is more effective than any policy we could implement." Janet's reply was even worse. "Exactly. If they think they're not ready for advancement, they won't ask for it, and we can continue leveraging their output without the associated cost increases." Reading those words felt like watching a magic trick explained. Suddenly, every conversation about my development needs, every suggestion that I wasn't quite ready for the next level, every piece of feedback about emotional readiness or collaboration skills, revealed itself as manipulation designed to keep me productive but powerless. But the email that made me want to burn the whole building down was from Garrett, sent just 3 days before Chloe's first visit to our office. "The Rodriguez meeting is crucial. Make sure Zara does the preparation work, but keep her out of the strategic discussion. We need her expertise, but can't afford to let her build a direct relationship with a client this valuable. If Meridian starts seeing her as the primary strategic resource, we lose control of the account." They'd known. From the very beginning, they'd understood exactly how valuable I was to the Meridian relationship, and they'd made a conscious decision to hide my contributions to maintain their own power. It wasn't incompetence or oversight. It was deliberate theft, planned and executed with the kind of cold calculation usually reserved for corporate espionage. As I sat there surrounded by evidence of 4 years of systematic abuse, I felt something shift inside me that went deeper than anger or hurt. It was clarity, clean and sharp as a surgical instrument. These people had stolen my work, sabotaged my career, and gaslit me into believing I wasn't good enough for opportunities I'd already earned 10 times over. They'd turned my colleagues against me through fear and intimidation, created a culture where success was punished and mediocrity was rewarded, and built their entire business model on the exploitation of talent they were too insecure to acknowledge. But what they hadn't counted on was that their most valuable victim would eventually become their most dangerous enemy. Because while they'd been busy perfecting their strategies for professional assassination, I'd been learning their methods, documenting their crimes, and building relationships they didn't even know existed. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. Not because I was eager to start my new job, though I was, but because I was ready to watch their carefully constructed empire of exploitation collapse under the weight of its own corruption. They taught me everything I needed to know about corporate warfare, and now I was going to use those lessons against them. The irony was perfect. They'd created the weapon that would destroy them, one stolen project and forged performance review at a time. Monday morning at Meridian Industries felt like stepping into an alternate universe where competence was rewarded instead of punished. The office occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in South Lake Union, with exposed brick walls, natural light streaming through massive windows, and an energy that buzzed with actual productivity rather than political maneuvering. But I wasn't there to admire the architecture. I was there to begin the most sophisticated corporate investigation of my career. Chloe met me at the elevator at 8:30 a.m. sharp, wearing a navy blazer and the kind of focused expression that told me she'd been planning this moment as carefully as I had. "Welcome to Meridian," she said, shaking my hand with the firmness of someone sealing a business deal. "Are you ready to get to work?" My new office was on the 15th floor, with a view of Elliott Bay and enough space for the strategic planning I'd never been allowed to do at Pinnacle. But the real prize was sitting on my desk. A brand new laptop with full administrative access, a corporate credit card with actual spending authority, and a file folder marked Pinnacle Marketing Solutions Account Review. "Everything you need to conduct a comprehensive audit of our previous vendor relationship," Chloe explained, settling into the chair across from my desk. "We've been documenting irregularities for the past 6 weeks, but we need someone with inside knowledge to help us understand the full scope of what's been happening." She opened the folder, revealing a meticulously organized collection of billing statements, email correspondence, and project deliverables that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning months. We started noticing discrepancies in March, when the invoiced hours began exceeding our actual meeting time by significant margins. Then we discovered that work we'd been billed for at senior consultant rates was clearly being performed by junior staff. I studied the documents, recognizing my own project timelines buried within Garrett's inflated billing reports. A strategy session that had taken me 3 hours to complete was billed as 8 hours of executive consultation. A campaign brief I'd written over a weekend was invoiced as collaborative senior-level strategic development, involving multiple team members who'd never even read the final document. "This is just the financial component," Chloe continued, pulling out another section of files. "We've also been tracking deliverable quality and consistency. Look at this timeline of strategic recommendations." She spread out a series of documents spanning the past year, each one containing strategic insights and campaign recommendations that I recognized as my own work. But according to Pinnacle's attribution, they'd all originated from different team members depending on who needed credit at any given moment. The same sustainability messaging framework had been credited to Garrett in March, David in June, and Bryce in September, as if strategic brilliance was a rotating assignment rather than the product of consistent analytical thinking. "The pattern became obvious once we started paying attention," Chloe said. "Whoever was taking credit for the strategic work clearly wasn't the person who understood the underlying logic. When we asked follow-up questions or requested modifications, the responses were either evasive or completely missed the point of the original recommendation." I felt a surge of vindication that was almost physical. For months, I'd wondered if I was being paranoid, if my suspicions about credit theft were just the product of professional insecurity. But here was objective evidence from an outside observer that the patterns I'd noticed were real, systematic, and obvious to anyone who bothered to pay attention. "There's something else," Chloe said, lowering her voice despite the privacy of my office. "We recorded several phone calls with Pinnacle leadership over the past month. Washington is a one-party consent state, so we're legally in the clear. But the content of those calls is illuminating." She pulled out a laptop and clicked play on an audio file dated 2 weeks ago. Garrett's voice filled the room, smooth and confident as always. "The key to our success with Meridian has been our integrated approach to strategic development. I personally oversee all high-level campaign conceptualization, while my team handles the tactical implementation." The recording continued with Garrett taking credit for specific campaign elements that I'd developed independently, including a digital engagement strategy that had increased Meridian's lead conversion rate by 43%. But what made the recording particularly damaging was his response to a question about account transition planning. "Of course, we've built redundancy into our service model," Garrett's voice continued. "While individual team members may come and go, the strategic vision remains consistent at the leadership level. That's the advantage of working with an established firm rather than relying on individual consultants." Chloe paused the recording. This was recorded the day after you submitted your resignation. He was already positioning your departure as irrelevant to the account relationship, even though our experience had been that you were the only person at Pinnacle who truly understood our business needs. The next recording was even more damaging. In a call from last Friday, 3 days after my public humiliation, Garrett was discussing transition plans with his usual arrogant confidence. "I'll be taking over strategic communications directly. Frankly, this gives us an opportunity to elevate the relationship to a more senior level. Sometimes you have to cut dead weight to move forward effectively." Dead weight. He'd called me dead weight to the client whose account I'd built from the ground up, whose strategic challenges I'd solved with solutions he couldn't even explain coherently. But the most damaging recording was from a 3-way call between Garrett, Janet, and David, discussing damage control strategies for my departure. Janet's voice was crisp and professional. "We need to be proactive about managing any potential negativity. If Zara tries to spread stories about her experience here, we have documentation of her performance issues that could be relevant." "What kind of documentation?" David asked. "The usual. Collaboration challenges, difficulty accepting feedback, unrealistic expectations about advancement timelines. Nothing actionable, but enough to establish a pattern of attitude problems." I stared at the laptop screen as the recording continued, listening to 3 people I'd worked alongside for years, casually discussing strategies for destroying my professional reputation if I became inconvenient. They weren't just planning to steal my work, they were preparing to character assassinate me if I ever tried to defend myself. "We have 6 more recordings like this," Chloe said quietly. All recorded during legitimate business calls where they volunteered information about their internal practices, and all of them painting a picture of systematic fraud, credit theft, and employee manipulation. She opened another folder, this one marked Legal Review. "Our corporate attorney has reviewed everything we've collected, and his opinion is that Pinnacle has engaged in fraudulent billing practices that could potentially void our entire contract. We're talking about grounds for demanding full restitution of fees paid over the past year, plus damages for misrepresentation." The number at the bottom of the legal memo made my breath catch. $847,000 in potentially recoverable fees, plus additional damages for breach of fiduciary duty. It wasn't just about holding Pinnacle accountable. It was about financial consequences that could potentially destroy the company. "But we need more than billing irregularities to build a comprehensive case," Chloe continued. "We need evidence that the misrepresentation was systematic rather than accidental, that there was deliberate intent to defraud rather than simple accounting errors." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "That's where you come in. You have 4 years of inside knowledge about their business practices, their internal communications, their standard operating procedures. We need you to help us understand whether what we experienced with Meridian was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern." I thought about the files scattered across my coffee table at home, the email chains documenting strategies for managing high-performer expectations, the performance improvement plans drafted as insurance against successful employees. I thought about the systematic credit theft, the billing fraud, the professional gaslighting that had nearly destroyed my confidence in my own abilities. "It's not isolated," I said. "It's their entire business model." Chloe smiled, but it wasn't pleasant. "Good. Because we're not just auditing our account relationship. We're building a case that will expose every unethical practice they've used to build their reputation on other people's work." She pulled out one final document, a timeline of investigative activities planned for the next 2 weeks. "We have meetings scheduled with 3 other Pinnacle clients who've expressed concerns about billing irregularities. We have a forensic accountant ready to analyze their financial records. And we have a private investigator who specializes in corporate fraud cases." The timeline was comprehensive, professional, and absolutely devastating. Meridian wasn't just changing vendors. They were conducting a systematic investigation that would expose Pinnacle's corruption to their entire client base, their professional network, and, potentially federal investigators. The best part, Chloe said, is that Garrett has no idea what's coming. As far as he knows, we're still just an unhappy client who might be switching vendors. He thinks he has time to manage the transition and minimize the damage. She closed the folders and looked at me directly. But we're not giving him that time. Tomorrow morning, we're presenting our findings to Pinnacle's leadership team. And by the end of the week, every client they've defrauded will know exactly what kind of operation they've been paying for. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what Meridian had prepared. This wasn't just justice. It was corporate warfare conducted with legal precision and unlimited resources. And I was no longer just a victim of Pinnacle's corruption. I was the secret weapon in their destruction. That evening, I sat in my new office until well past sunset, working alongside Meridian's legal team to prepare for what Chloe had termed the reckoning. The conference room on the 16th floor had been transformed into a war room, with whiteboards covered in timelines, evidence binders organized by category, and a presentation that would systematically dismantle 4 years of Pinnacle's carefully constructed lies. But I wasn't just providing information. I was learning that I had allies I'd never known existed. Thomas Chen, Meridian's general counsel, turned out to be a former federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. What we're documenting here goes beyond simple billing disputes, he explained, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the evidence I'd provided from my home files. This is systematic fraud with clear intent to deceive. The performance improvement plans alone constitute evidence of a conspiracy to suppress employee compensation while extracting maximum value from their work. Rebecca Silva, Meridian's chief financial officer, had spent the afternoon running forensic analysis on Pinnacle's billing patterns across all their major accounts. The mathematical precision is actually damning, she said, pointing to a spreadsheet that made my stomach turn. Look at this pattern. Every month, Garrett's billed hours increase by exactly 12% over the previous month, regardless of actual project scope. That's not organic billing variation. That's systematic inflation designed to stay below audit thresholds. The most shocking revelation came from Marcus Webb, a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud cases. He'd spent the past 3 days conducting what he called preliminary surveillance of Pinnacle's operations, which apparently involved a lot more than I'd realized was possible. Your former colleagues have been very busy since your departure, Marcus said, opening a laptop that contained what looked like screenshots of internal communications. They've been reaching out to other vendors, trying to backfill your account management capabilities. But here's the interesting part. They're describing the Meridian account requirements in ways that suggest they never actually understood the strategic work you were doing. He showed me a series of job postings that Pinnacle had published on LinkedIn and industry websites, looking for senior account managers with sustainability marketing experience and strategic consultants with renewable energy sector expertise. The descriptions were generic enough to be meaningless, suggesting that Garrett had no idea how to replace the specific knowledge and relationships I'd built with Meridian's leadership team. But the real problem for them, Marcus continued, is that they're hemorrhaging other clients too. We've identified at least 4 other accounts that have raised billing concerns in the past month. 2 of them have already initiated their own audits. Chloe looked up from her own preparation materials. That's the beauty of systematic fraud. Once one client starts asking the right questions, the pattern becomes obvious to everyone else. Garrett built his entire business model on the assumption that clients wouldn't compare notes or dig too deeply into billing details. The presentation we were preparing wasn't just about Meridian's account. It was a comprehensive exposure of Pinnacle's entire operation. Thomas had structured it like a federal prosecution, with exhibits documenting patterns of fraud, witness statements from multiple clients, and financial analysis that would make denial impossible. The key, Thomas explained, is that we're not just presenting problems, we're offering solutions. Every piece of evidence we show them will be paired with specific actions they can take to address the issues. It's going to be very difficult for them to dismiss this as a disgruntled client complaint when we're providing them with a roadmap for legal compliance. But what made me feel truly powerful was the discovery that I wasn't Pinnacle's only victim. Rebecca had reached out to former employees who'd left the company over the past 2 years, and 3 of them had agreed to provide statements about their experiences. Each story followed the same pattern I'd lived through: initial success followed by systematic undermining, credit theft disguised as team collaboration, and ultimately either resignation or termination accompanied by threats about professional reputation. Sarah Martinez left 18 months ago after Garrett took credit for a campaign that won a regional advertising award, Rebecca explained, reading from her notes. She tried to address it through HR, but Janet documented the complaint as, quote, difficulty sharing credit for team successes, and put her on a performance improvement plan. Kevin Thompson was terminated last year for what they called, quote, failure to meet collaboration standards, she continued. But according to his documentation, the real issue was that he'd started questioning billing practices after noticing his hourly estimates were being doubled on client invoices. And Lisa Park resigned 6 months ago after being passed over for promotion despite managing their 3 largest accounts. Her exit interview notes mention unrealistic advancement expectations and, quote, emotional immaturity regarding feedback. The pattern was so consistent, it read like a playbook for professional destruction. Pinnacle had been systematically identifying their most valuable employees, extracting maximum work from them, and then discrediting them when they became inconvenient or started demanding appropriate recognition. But what made this particularly satisfying was learning about the support network that was forming around tomorrow's confrontation. Thomas had reached out to colleagues at the Better Business Bureau, the American Marketing Association, and the Washington State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. We're not just addressing this internally, he explained. We're creating a paper trail that will follow Pinnacle's leadership for the rest of their careers. Marcus had prepared what he called impact documentation, a comprehensive analysis of how Pinnacle's fraud had affected not just their clients, but the broader marketing industry in Seattle. When agencies engage in systematic billing fraud, it damages trust in the entire sector, he said. Professional organizations take that very seriously, especially when there's clear evidence of pattern behavior. The most powerful ally, though, was someone I'd never expected, Dr. Amanda Foster, an organizational psychology professor at the University of Washington, who specialized in workplace abuse and corporate toxicity. Chloe had consulted with her about the psychological manipulation tactics documented in Pinnacle's internal communications. What you've experienced is a textbook case of institutional gaslighting, Dr. Foster explained during a video call that evening. The performance improvement plans, the credit theft, the systematic undermining, these are deliberate strategies designed to maintain power imbalances while extracting maximum productivity from vulnerable employees.
She'd prepared a written analysis that would be included in tomorrow's presentation, explaining how Pinnacle's internal policies constituted a hostile work environment that violated multiple employment law protections. The email evidence you provided shows clear intent to suppress advancement opportunities based on perceived threats to existing power structures. That's not just unethical. It's potentially illegal under federal employment discrimination statutes. As the evening wore on, I began to understand that tomorrow's meeting wasn't just about confronting Garrett and his team. It was about exposing a systematic operation that had been damaging careers and defrauding clients for years. The evidence we'd assembled wasn't just compelling, it was overwhelming, documented from multiple perspectives, and supported by independent professional analysis. But the most satisfying preparation came when Chloe asked me to review the final presentation and suggest any modifications. As I read through the comprehensive documentation of everything I'd lived through for 4 years, I realized that tomorrow wouldn't just be about justice, it would be about validation. Every time I'd questioned my own perceptions, every time I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive or too ambitious, every time I'd blamed myself for not advancing despite strong performance, all of that self-doubt was being systematically disproven by objective evidence and expert analysis. There's one more thing, Chloe said as we finished our preparations. We've scheduled a follow-up meeting for Thursday with representatives from Pinnacle's 3 largest remaining clients. They'll be reviewing the same evidence we're presenting tomorrow, and they'll have an opportunity to share their own experiences with billing irregularities or service quality issues. She smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm rather than predatory. By the end of the week, Garrett will have lost not just Meridian's account, but potentially 60% of his client base. And instead of being able to claim that we were just a difficult client, he'll be facing questions from his entire professional network about why so many organizations are reaching the same conclusions about his business practices. As I gathered my materials and prepared to head home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my own professional judgment. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be walking into a meeting as a victim seeking validation. I'd be walking in as an expert witness, armed with unshakable evidence and supported by a team of professionals who understood exactly what they were dealing with. Garrett had taught me everything I needed to know about corporate warfare through 4 years of psychological abuse. Now I was going to show him what happened when those lessons were applied by someone who actually understood strategy. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes Seattle feel like the center of the universe. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 6:30 a.m., adjusting the collar of the navy blue suit I'd bought specifically for this moment. Not because I needed to look professional, but because I wanted to look victorious. Today wasn't about proving myself anymore. Today was about watching 4 years of systematic abuse collapse under the weight of truth. The Meridian team assembled in our conference room at 8:15 a.m., each of us carrying specific roles in what Thomas had termed the presentation that ends careers. Chloe would handle the executive summary and relationship management. Thomas would present the legal findings and compliance violations. Rebecca would walk through the financial fraud documentation. Marcus would provide evidence of ongoing deceptive practices. And I would serve as the technical expert, explaining exactly how each fraudulent practice had been implemented and concealed. But what made this morning feel different from every other high-stakes meeting I'd ever attended was the complete absence of anxiety. For 4 years, I'd walked into important presentations, wondering if I'd be allowed to speak, if my ideas would be stolen, if someone else would take credit for my preparation. Today, I was walking into a meeting where my expertise was not just valued, it was the foundation of everything we were about to accomplish. At 9:47 a.m., 3 minutes before the scheduled start time, Garrett strode into Meridian's lobby with the kind of confident swagger that suggested he thought this was just another client retention meeting. He'd brought Janet and David as backup, probably expecting to overwhelm us with executive presence and smooth talk. What he didn't expect was to be escorted to a conference room where 6 Meridian professionals were waiting, with 47 pages of documented evidence and a presentation that would systematically destroy his professional reputation. I watched through the glass wall as Garrett shook hands with Chloe, his practiced smile faltering slightly when he noticed the formal setup: projection equipment, legal pads, and a stack of binders that suggested this wasn't going to be a casual conversation about contract terms. Janet's expression tightened as she recognized the serious atmosphere, and David's nervous laugh made its inevitable appearance. "Thank you all for coming," Chloe began, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that preceded corporate executions. "We've asked for this meeting to discuss some concerns that have emerged regarding our vendor relationship with Pinnacle Marketing Solutions." Garrett leaned back in his chair, deploying the relaxed confidence that had intimidated me for years. "Of course, Chloe. We're always interested in feedback that can help us improve our service delivery. What specific areas would you like to address?" Thomas opened the first binder and placed it in front of Garrett with the deliberate precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "We'd like to start with billing irregularities that suggest systematic fraud spanning the entire duration of our business relationship." The change in Garrett's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in posture that suggested he was beginning to understand this wasn't a routine client meeting. Janet leaned forward to examine the documents, and I watched her face go pale as she recognized the level of detail in our financial analysis. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by irregularities," Garrett said, his voice maintaining its smooth tone despite the obvious stress. "We've always been transparent about our billing practices and project scope management." Rebecca stood and moved to the projection screen, where she'd prepared a side-by-side comparison that would make denial impossible. Let's examine transparency, shall we? On the left, we have Pinnacle's invoice hours for strategic consultation on the Meridian account for the month of August. 847 hours billed at your senior rate of $350 per hour. She clicked to the next slide. On the right, we have our internal calendar records showing actual meeting time with Pinnacle representatives during that same period. 32 hours of documented interaction, all with Zara Daniels, who we now understand was classified as junior staff despite managing all strategic development. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Even allowing for preparation time and internal strategy development, there was no legitimate explanation for billing 26 times more hours than actual client interaction had required. There must be some misunderstanding about how agency billing works, David interjected, his nervous energy ratcheting up. Strategic development requires significant behind-the-scenes work, research, competitive analysis. We thought you might say that, Marcus interrupted, opening his laptop. So we documented exactly what behind-the-scenes work was being performed. The recording that filled the room was from a phone call 3 weeks ago. Garrett's voice explaining to a potential new hire how Pinnacle managed client relationships. The key is to maximize billable hours while minimizing actual resource allocation. We bill everything at senior rates but use junior staff for execution. It's more profitable, and most clients don't pay close enough attention to notice the discrepancy. Janet's face had gone from pale to gray. David's nervous laugh had disappeared entirely. And Garrett, for the first time in the 4 years I'd known him, looked genuinely speechless. But Thomas wasn't finished. That recording was made during a legitimate business call where you volunteered information about your billing practices. Washington is a one-party consent state, so we're legally authorized to use it as evidence of intentional fraud. He opened another binder, this one containing the email chains I'd provided about performance management strategies. We'd also like to discuss your employee management practices, particularly the systematic suppression of advancement opportunities for high-performing staff. Chloe took over the presentation, her voice steady and professional as she read directly from Janet's email about managing, quote, problem employees who showed too much initiative. This document outlines specific strategies for preventing talented staff from building client relationships or receiving appropriate recognition for their work. Would you like to explain how these practices serve your clients' interests? Janet finally found her voice, though it came out strained and defensive. Those communications were taken out of context. Employee development is a complex process that requires careful management of expectations and responsibilities.
Development, I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. Every head turned toward me, and I felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from knowing I was absolutely right. Is that what you call drafting performance improvement plans for employees immediately after they deliver exceptional results? I opened my own folder and placed Janet's draft PIP on the table, the one she'd written 2 weeks after I'd landed the Meridian account. This document cites communication challenges and difficulty managing client expectations. But it was written the same day that Meridian sent Pinnacle a glowing review specifically requesting that I remain their primary contact. The silence in the room was deafening. Garrett was staring at the document like it might spontaneously combust. Janet was looking anywhere except at the people around the table, and David had developed a visible tremor in his hands. Thomas resumed control of the presentation, his prosecutor instincts taking over. The pattern of evidence suggests systematic fraud, employment law violations, and breach of fiduciary duty. We've compiled documentation spanning 4 years of similar practices, affecting multiple employees and client accounts. He placed a final document on the table, a formal demand letter that would legally require Pinnacle to respond within 10 business days. We're requesting full restitution of fraudulent billing charges, estimated at $847,000, plus damages for misrepresentation and breach of contract. Rebecca added the financial component that would make resistance impossible. We've also identified similar billing irregularities in your relationships with Coastal Credit Union, Northwest Foods, and Evergreen Solar. All three organizations will be receiving copies of this documentation and invited to conduct their own audits. The implications hit Garrett like a physical blow. 4 major clients, representing nearly 70% of Pinnacle's revenue, would be questioning every invoice, every service claim, every strategic recommendation they'd ever paid for. The company's entire business model was about to be exposed as systematic fraud. But Chloe delivered the final devastating revelation. Most importantly, we want you to meet our new Director of Strategic Marketing. She gestured toward me, and I stood slowly, savoring the moment I'd been preparing for since that humiliating morning when they'd laughed at my resignation letter. Zara will be managing all of Meridian's marketing initiatives moving forward, Chloe continued. She'll also be available to consult with other clients who have questions about their experiences with Pinnacle's service delivery. Garrett's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of desperate anger that made him look older and smaller than I'd ever seen him. "You can't do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're destroying people's careers based on misunderstandings and disgruntled employee complaints." I smiled, feeling 4 years of suppressed confidence flooding back all at once. "I'm not destroying anything, Garrett. I'm just making sure everyone knows exactly who did the work they've been paying for." The meeting lasted another 47 minutes, but the outcome had been decided in the first 10. By the time Pinnacle's leadership team gathered their materials and walked out of Meridian's conference room, they understood that their company was facing potential bankruptcy, federal investigation, and professional disgrace. But what made this moment truly perfect wasn't just the justice, it was the complete reversal of power. 4 days ago, I'd been the humiliated employee carrying a cardboard box. Today, I was the strategic expert whose testimony would determine whether Pinnacle Marketing Solutions survived the week. The news broke faster than I'd anticipated. By 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday, less than 3 hours after Garrett had stumbled out of Meridian's conference room, looking like he'd been hit by a freight train, my phone started buzzing with calls from reporters, industry colleagues, and former Pinnacle employees who'd heard whispers of what was happening. The first call came from Jennifer Walsh at the Seattle Business Journal. "Zara, I'm hearing rumors about major irregularities at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. Are you available for comment?" I was still in my office at Meridian, reviewing transition documents and trying to process the emotional whiplash of watching 4 years of abuse collapse in a single morning. "I'm not able to comment on ongoing legal matters," I said, using the language Thomas had coached me on. "But I can confirm that I've accepted a position as Director of Strategic Marketing at Meridian Industries." The second call came 20 minutes later from Brad Morrison at Marketing Weekly, a trade publication that Garrett had always cultivated carefully. "We're getting reports that Meridian Industries has terminated their relationship with Pinnacle over billing disputes. Can you verify whether this is related to your recent departure from the agency?" That question told me everything I needed to know about how fast information was traveling through Seattle's tight-knit marketing community. Somehow, word was already spreading that my resignation and Meridian's vendor change weren't coincidental events. But the call that made my heart race came at 4:15 p.m. from someone I hadn't expected to hear from: Sarah Martinez, the former Pinnacle employee who'd left 18 months ago after Garrett stole credit for her award-winning campaign. "Zara, please tell me this is really happening." Sarah's voice was urgent, almost breathless. "I just got off the phone with a reporter who said Pinnacle is facing fraud allegations. Is it true?" "I can't discuss the details," I said carefully, "but I can tell you that several former employees have been contacted by investigators looking into systematic billing and employment practices." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. I thought I was crazy. For 18 months, I thought maybe I really was too sensitive. Maybe I really didn't deserve credit for work I'd done myself. But if this is happening, if other people saw the same patterns. "You weren't crazy," I said firmly, "and you weren't too sensitive. You were being systematically gaslit by people who built their careers on stealing other people's work. By 5 p.m., the story had taken on a life of its own. Marcus called with an update that made me sit down hard in my office chair. 3 more former Pinnacle employees have reached out to provide statements. 2 current employees have contacted employment attorneys. And here's the kicker. Coastal Credit Union just announced they're conducting an emergency audit of all vendor relationships. The domino effect was accelerating beyond anything we'd planned. What had started as Meridian's vendor dispute was rapidly becoming an industry-wide examination of Pinnacle's business practices. But the most satisfying update came from Rebecca, who had been monitoring Pinnacle's social media and professional networking activity. "They're in full crisis mode," she reported with barely contained glee. "Janet has deleted her LinkedIn account. David has removed all references to Pinnacle from his professional profiles. And Garrett hasn't posted anything since yesterday morning." The silence from Pinnacle's leadership was telling. In an industry built on communication and public relations, their complete absence from digital platforms suggested they understood exactly how indefensible their position had become. At 6:30 p.m., I finally allowed myself to walk over to the windows of my new office and look out at Elliott Bay. The sunset was painting the water gold and pink, and for the first time in 4 years, I watched it without feeling the crushing weight of unfinished work, or stolen credit or systematic undermining. I was free, and more than that, I was powerful. The evening brought revelations that exceeded even Thomas's prosecutorial expectations. At 7:45 p.m., he called with news that made me understand the true scope of what we'd unleashed. The Washington State Bar Association has opened a preliminary investigation into Janet Morrison's professional conduct, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd spent years watching corporate criminals escape consequences. Employment lawyers are calling her performance improvement plan strategy a textbook case of creating hostile work environment documentation to justify discriminatory practices. But the news that made me actually laugh out loud came at 8:20 p.m., when Chloe forwarded me an email that had been sent to Meridian's general inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent Contract Clarification Request," and the sender was Garrett Thornfield. The email was 3 paragraphs of barely coherent legal language, essentially begging Meridian to reconsider their hasty decision to terminate the vendor relationship. Garrett offered to personally manage the account moving forward, to provide, quote, "enhanced transparency in billing practices," and to implement, quote, "improved communication protocols that would address any concerns about service delivery." What made it particularly pathetic was the desperate attempt to frame the fraud allegations as communication misunderstandings. "We believe there may have been some confusion about industry-standard billing practices and project scope documentation," the email read. "We're committed to working collaboratively to resolve any perceived discrepancies." Perceived discrepancies. $847,000 in documented fraud had been reduced to, quote, "perceived discrepancies" in Garrett's mind. But the email that arrived at 9:15 p.m. was the one that told me Pinnacle's situation had moved beyond damage control into genuine crisis. It came from Kevin Thompson, the former employee who'd been terminated for questioning billing practices, and it contained information that changed everything. "Zara, I just heard about what's happening at Pinnacle, and I need to tell you something I probably should have reported a year ago," Kevin wrote. "Before they fired me, I discovered that Garrett has been using a shell company to inflate project costs on major accounts. He's been billing clients for work that's actually being done offshore for a fraction of the cost, then pocketing the difference through a consulting firm that only exists on paper." The attached documentation was devastating. Incorporation records for something called Strategic Solutions Consulting, bank statements showing regular transfers from Pinnacle's business account, and email chains where Garrett discussed optimizing cost structures through alternative resource allocation. I forwarded Kevin's email to Thomas immediately, knowing that this evidence transformed our civil billing dispute into potential federal wire fraud charges. What we'd thought was systematic billing inflation was actually sophisticated money laundering disguised as agency operations. Thomas called back within 20 minutes, his prosecutor instincts fully activated. This changes everything. We're not just talking about employment law violations anymore. We're talking about criminal fraud that could result in federal charges. I'm contacting the FBI's white-collar crime unit first thing tomorrow morning. The scope of Garrett's corruption was staggering. For years, he'd been not just stealing credit from employees and overcharging clients, but actually funneling money through fraudulent consulting arrangements that existed solely to enrich himself. The performance improvement plans, the systematic employee suppression, the credit theft, all of it had been designed to prevent anyone from getting close enough to discover the financial fraud that was funding his lifestyle. As I sat in my apartment that night, reading through Kevin's documentation and trying to process the magnitude of what we'd uncovered, I realized that my resignation letter had been more prophetic than I'd intended. I'd written about pursuing opportunities that aligned with my commitment to ethical business practices, never imagining that I was actually escaping a criminal enterprise disguised as a marketing agency. The final call of the evening came at 11:30 p.m. from Marcus, who'd been conducting what he called digital forensics on Pinnacle's online presence. "You need to see this," he said. Garrett just posted a statement on the company website announcing that he's taking a temporary leave of absence due to, quote, family health issues. Janet has been named interim CEO, and they're bringing in an outside consultant to, quote, review operational procedures. Family health issues. The oldest excuse in the corporate crisis management playbook. Deployed when executives needed to disappear while their lawyers figured out damage control strategies. But what made this particularly satisfying was knowing that Garrett's carefully constructed empire of exploitation was collapsing not because of external pressure, but because of internal contradictions he'd created himself. Every employee he'd abused, every client he'd defrauded, every lie he'd told to maintain his position, all of it was coming back to destroy the reputation he'd built on other people's work. As I turned off the lights and prepared for what I knew would be a very interesting Wednesday morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete confidence in the justice of what was happening. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new consequences, and new validation that the patterns I'd questioned for so long were not just real but criminal. The best part was knowing that while Garrett was probably lying awake figuring out legal defense strategies, I would be sleeping peacefully in preparation for my first full day as a senior marketing executive whose expertise was valued, whose contributions were recognized, and whose professional judgment had been vindicated by the most comprehensive fraud investigation Seattle's marketing community had ever witnessed. 3 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Federal Building in downtown Seattle, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as news vans lined up outside like vultures circling a carcass. Today was the day federal prosecutors would announce the indictments that had grown out of what started as a simple billing dispute between Meridian Industries and a mid-sized marketing agency. The investigation had expanded far beyond anything we'd imagined during those initial meetings in Meridian's conference room. What Thomas had initially described as systematic fraud had evolved into a multi-agency investigation involving the FBI's white-collar crime unit, the Washington State Attorney General's office, and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Garrett's shell company scheme had triggered federal wire fraud charges, money laundering allegations, and tax evasion counts that could result in decades of prison time. But the most satisfying development wasn't the criminal charges. It was watching the complete collapse of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions as an ongoing business entity. The company that had systematically abused employees and defrauded clients for years had simply ceased to exist, not through dramatic bankruptcy proceedings, but through the quiet exodus of everyone who'd ever worked there. Janet Morrison had been the first to abandon ship. 2 weeks after our confrontation meeting, she'd submitted her resignation as interim CEO and immediately moved to Portland, where she'd taken a job with a nonprofit organization that apparently hadn't conducted thorough background checks. The Oregon State Bar was still investigating her employment law violations, but she'd managed to escape Seattle before the criminal charges materialized. David Fletcher had tried to reinvent himself as an independent marketing consultant, but his LinkedIn profile remained conspicuously empty of client testimonials or case studies. The nervous laugh that had once irritated me in meetings had apparently become a liability when trying to establish credibility with potential clients who'd heard about Pinnacle's implosion. Bryce Hamilton had disappeared entirely from the Seattle marketing scene. According to Marcus's investigative research, he'd moved to Phoenix and was working at a chain restaurant, while his legal team negotiated plea agreements for his role in the employee suppression conspiracy. The man who'd once used military metaphors to describe marketing campaigns was now learning that actual warfare involved consequences he'd never anticipated. The former Pinnacle office space on the 32nd floor of the Rainier Tower had been taken over by a sustainable energy consulting firm, a detail that felt like poetic justice, given how many renewable energy campaigns I'd developed while my contributions were systematically erased from recognition. But the most dramatic transformation had been in the Seattle marketing community itself. The Pinnacle investigation had triggered what industry publications were calling a, quote, transparency revolution, with agencies across the region implementing new billing accountability measures, employee recognition protocols, and client communication standards designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had defined Garrett's business model. Sarah Martinez had returned to Seattle and started her own agency, specializing in campaigns for companies that prioritized ethical business practices. She'd called me last week to discuss a potential collaboration between her firm and Meridian Industries, a conversation that would have been impossible when we were both trapped under Pinnacle's oppressive hierarchy. Kevin Thompson had been hired as a forensic consultant by the FBI, using his insider knowledge of corporate fraud schemes to help investigators identify similar patterns at other agencies. His wrongful termination lawsuit against Pinnacle had been settled for an undisclosed amount that his attorney described as, quote, life-changing. Lisa Park had joined a major nonprofit organization as their director of communications, where her strategic expertise was finally receiving the recognition it deserved. She'd sent me a handwritten note after the indictments were announced, saying simply, "Thank you for proving we weren't crazy." The validation was overwhelming, but it was also deeply emotional. For months after leaving Pinnacle, I'd received messages from former colleagues, industry contacts, and even people I'd never met who'd heard about the investigation and wanted to share their own experiences with workplace abuse and systematic exploitation. The pattern I'd lived through wasn't unique. It was endemic to entire sectors of corporate America, enabled by cultures that prioritized power preservation over talent development. Dr. Amanda Foster, the organizational psychology professor who'd provided expert analysis for our legal case, had asked me to speak at a conference about corporate toxicity and employee resilience. "Your case has become a textbook example of how systematic abuse operates," she'd explained during our preparation call. But more importantly, it demonstrates how individual courage can expose institutional corruption. The conference presentation had been surreal, standing in front of 200 HR professionals and employment attorneys, explaining how performance improvement plans could be weaponized, how credit theft could be systematized, and how gaslighting could be institutionalized through seemingly professional policies. The audience had been horrified but also energized, recognizing patterns they'd seen in their own organizations and committing to implement structural changes that would prevent similar abuse. Meanwhile, my work at Meridian Industries had exceeded every expectation I'd had when Chloe first offered me the position. The strategic marketing initiatives I'd developed had contributed to a 47% increase in qualified leads, a 32% improvement in customer retention, and recognition from industry publications as one of the most innovative sustainability marketing programs in the Pacific Northwest. But more importantly, I was working in an environment where collaboration meant actual partnership rather than credit theft disguised as teamwork. When I developed successful campaigns, my name appeared on case studies and award submissions. When I presented strategic recommendations, They were attributed to my analysis, rather than being repackaged under someone else's leadership. When I requested resources for professional development, they were approved based on merit, rather than being filtered through political considerations about who deserved advancement opportunities. The team I'd built at Meridian reflected everything I'd learned about healthy workplace culture during my years of experiencing its opposite. We hired based on talent and potential rather than political compatibility. We promoted based on results and growth rather than tenure and networking ability. We addressed conflicts through direct communication rather than passive-aggressive documentation strategies. 3 weeks ago, Chloe had asked me to take on additional responsibilities as Senior Director of Strategic Marketing, with expanded authority over campaign development and a team of 6 marketing professionals who would report directly to me. The promotion came with a salary increase that put my compensation 40% above what I'd been earning at Pinnacle, plus equity options that could be worth significant money as Meridian continued its growth trajectory. But the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The American Marketing Association had invited me to join their ethics committee, specifically because of my role in exposing systematic fraud within the industry. "We need professionals who've demonstrated the courage to challenge corruption," the committee chair had explained. "Your experience provides credibility that can help us develop stronger accountability standards." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same expertise that Garrett had systematically suppressed and Janet had tried to undermine through performance improvement plans was now being recognized at the national level as valuable institutional knowledge worthy of shaping industry standards. Standing in that federal building lobby, watching reporters prepare to cover the legal consequences of Pinnacle's systematic abuse, I felt something that went beyond personal satisfaction or professional vindication. I felt like I'd participated in something larger than individual justice, a systemic correction that would make it harder for future Garretts to build careers on other people's stolen work. Thomas emerged from the elevator at 2:45 p.m., carrying the briefcase that contained 4 years of documented evidence and 3 months of federal investigation findings. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his prosecutor instincts clearly energized by the magnitude of what we were about to witness. I straightened my shoulders and checked my reflection in the building's polished marble walls. I was wearing the same navy blue suit I'd chosen for that confrontation meeting at Meridian, but today it felt different. Not like armor for battle, but like professional attire for someone whose expertise was valued and whose judgment had been completely vindicated. "I've been ready for this since the day they called my resignation letter pathetic," I said, walking toward the press conference that would officially announce the end of Garrett Thornfield's career and the beginning of a new chapter in corporate accountability. The best part was knowing that while Garrett was probably meeting with his defense attorneys and trying to negotiate plea agreements that would minimize his prison time, I would be returning to Meridian Industries to continue building the kind of ethical marketing practice that proved success didn't require stealing other people's work. Some stories end with revenge. This one was ending with transformation. 1 year later, I stood in the rooftop garden of Meridian Industries' new headquarters in South Lake Union, watching the sun set over Elliott Bay while reviewing the agenda for tomorrow's board meeting. The company had grown by 230% since I'd joined as Director of Strategic Marketing, and my team of 18 marketing professionals was now being studied by business schools as an example of how ethical workplace culture could drive exceptional results. The view from the 40th floor was spectacular, but what made this moment truly meaningful wasn't the financial success or the professional recognition. It was the email I'd received that morning from a marketing student at the University of Washington who was writing her thesis on corporate whistleblowing and systematic fraud prevention. "Your case has inspired a generation of professionals to recognize that individual courage can create institutional change," she'd written. "But I'm particularly interested in what happened after the justice phase. How do you rebuild trust in yourself and others after experiencing systematic gaslighting for years?" The question had made me pause because it addressed something that rarely gets discussed in stories about corporate revenge: the long, complicated process of healing from systematic abuse, even when that abuse has been publicly vindicated and legally punished. The truth was that watching Garrett get sentenced to 6 years in federal prison had been satisfying, but it hadn't immediately erased 4 years of conditioning that had taught me to doubt my own professional judgment. Learning that Janet had been disbarred and would never practice HR again had felt like justice, but it hadn't instantly restored my confidence in workplace authority figures. Seeing David's independent consulting business fail spectacularly had been gratifying, but it hadn't automatically healed the part of me that had been trained to expect credit theft and systematic undermining. The real transformation had happened slowly, through thousands of small moments where my expertise was valued, my contributions were recognized, and my professional growth was genuinely supported rather than strategically suppressed. It had happened through building relationships with colleagues who saw collaboration as partnership rather than competition, who shared credit generously instead of hoarding it defensively, and who addressed conflicts through direct communication rather than passive-aggressive documentation strategies. Dr. Amanda Foster had become not just a case study collaborator but a trusted advisor who helped me understand the psychological recovery process that follows systematic workplace abuse. Trauma doesn't end when the perpetrator is punished, she'd explained during one of our quarterly check-ins. Healing happens when you start believing in your own worth again, not because external validation proves it, but because you remember what you knew about yourself before the abuse began. That remembering process had been facilitated by the work itself. Leading Meridian's marketing transformation had required me to trust my strategic instincts, defend my analytical conclusions, and advocate for resources and recognition, all skills that had been systematically undermined during my years at Pinnacle. Every successful campaign, every client testimonial, every team member who thrived under my leadership had been evidence that my professional judgment was not just valid, but valuable. The most powerful healing had come through mentoring other professionals who'd experienced similar systematic abuse. The American Marketing Association's Ethics Committee had connected me with dozens of marketing professionals who'd encountered credit theft, billing fraud, performance manipulation, and professional gaslighting in their own careers. Helping them navigate legal resources, document evidence, and rebuild confidence had reminded me that my experience at Pinnacle wasn't a personal failing. It was a predictable result of toxic systems designed to exploit talented people while maintaining power imbalances. 3 months ago, I testified before a congressional subcommittee examining workplace abuse and corporate fraud prevention. The hearing had been part of broader legislation designed to strengthen whistleblower protections and create federal accountability standards for employment practices. Sitting at that witness table explaining how performance improvement plans could be weaponized and how billing fraud could be systematized had felt like the culmination of a journey that began with a resignation letter someone had called, quote, pathetic. But the most meaningful recognition had come from sources I'd never expected. Sarah Martinez, Kevin Thompson, and Lisa Park had all built successful careers that leveraged the expertise they'd developed despite Pinnacle's systematic suppression. The 4 of us had started meeting quarterly for what we jokingly called survivor dinners, conversations that combined professional networking with mutual support for the ongoing psychological work of recovery from corporate abuse. Last month, we decided to formalize our collaboration by creating the Professional Integrity Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting workers who experience systematic workplace abuse and providing resources for companies that want to implement ethical business practices. The Foundation's first initiative would be a legal defense fund for employees who risk retaliation when reporting corporate fraud or employment law violations. The funding had come from an unexpected source. The restitution settlement from Pinnacle's bankruptcy proceedings had been distributed among the employees and clients who'd been defrauded, and all 4 of us had donated our settlements to create the Foundation's initial endowment. Turning the money we'd recovered from our own exploitation into resources for other victims had felt like the perfect transformation of pain into purpose. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been personal rather than professional. 6 months ago, I'd started dating Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic accountant who'd worked on the Pinnacle investigation and understood firsthand the kind of systematic corruption that had shaped my early career. Our relationship had been built on mutual respect for each other's expertise, shared commitment to ethical professional practices, and a deep appreciation for the kind of trust that can only exist between people who've never tried to steal credit from each other. Michael had proposed 3 weeks ago during a hiking trip to Mount Rainier, choosing a moment when we were discussing our shared vision for creating business practices that prioritized integrity over profit maximization. The engagement ring was beautiful, but what made the proposal perfect was his understanding that building a life together meant supporting each other's professional growth rather than competing for recognition or resources. As I stood in that rooftop garden, reviewing tomorrow's agenda and thinking about the marketing team I'd built, the foundation we'd created, and the relationship I was building with someone who valued my expertise as much as I valued his, I realized that the real victory hadn't been watching Garrett's empire collapse. It had been discovering that success didn't require systematic exploitation of other people's work. The agenda for tomorrow's board meeting included a presentation about Meridian's expansion into new renewable energy markets, a strategic initiative that had grown out of campaign work I'd led and been fully credited for. The presentation would be delivered by 3 team members who developed expertise under my mentorship, and their names would appear on every slide alongside mine, because ethical leadership means sharing credit rather than hoarding it. Tomorrow evening, I'd be speaking at a conference for young marketing professionals about building careers that prioritize integrity over advancement, collaboration over competition, and systemic change over individual success. The audience would include students from the University of Washington, including the thesis writer who'd asked about rebuilding trust after systematic abuse. My answer to her question had become the foundation of my speaking presentations. Justice feels good, but healing feels better. Revenge provides temporary satisfaction, but building something ethical and sustainable provides lasting fulfillment. The real victory isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's proving that success doesn't require hurting other people. As the Seattle skyline lit up against the darkening sky, I felt something I'd never experienced during my years at Pinnacle: complete confidence that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use my expertise ethically, mentor other professionals generously, and continue building the kind of career that creates value rather than extracting it from other people's stolen work. Some stories end with the villain's punishment. This one was ending with the hero's transformation into someone who could prevent future villains from creating future victims. And that felt like the most powerful revenge of all, using the lessons learned from systematic abuse to build systems that made such abuse impossible. The resignation letter they'd called pathetic had become the first chapter of a career dedicated to proving that ethical business practices weren't just morally superior, they were also more profitable, more sustainable, and infinitely more satisfying than building success on foundations of fraud and exploitation. Somewhere in Seattle, there was probably another talented professional sitting in a toxic workplace, wondering if the patterns they were noticing were real, or if they were just being too sensitive. Tomorrow, that person would have resources, legal protections, and a support network that hadn't existed when I was trapped under Pinnacle's systematic abuse. And that transformation from victim to advocate, from exploitation to empowerment, from pathetic resignation to powerful testimony, that was the real story worth telling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.